The warm spring afternoon in Cedar Grove was like any other day for Officer James Miller. His polished badge gleamed under the bright sunlight as he sat in his patrol car, watching traffic flow along Maple Street. After 12 years on the force, Miller had developed what he called a sixth sense for spotting trouble, though his colleagues had noticed this sense seemed to activate more frequently when minorities drove through his patrol area. At 2:45 p.m., a sleek black Mercedes S-Class caught his attention. The car was well maintained and clearly expensive, but Miller's eyes narrowed as he observed the driver, a well-dressed black woman in her mid-30s. She wasn't speeding, and her vehicle showed no obvious violations, but something about her presence in this predominantly white neighborhood didn't sit right with him. Probably borrowed or stolen, Miller muttered to himself, a habit he'd developed during his solo patrols. Without hesitation, he pulled out behind the Mercedes and activated his lights. The driver, Angela Thompson, noticed the police cruiser in her rearview mirror. She had just finished a long conference call about an ongoing FBI investigation into police misconduct in several precincts. As the newly appointed special agent in charge of the Regional Civil Rights Division, she had spent months gathering evidence of systematic discrimination. With a tired sigh, she perfectly executed a proper stop, pulling over to the side of the road, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel. Miller parked his cruiser exactly 7 feet behind her vehicle, a distance he considered tactically advantageous. He took his time exiting his vehicle, adjusting his belt and straightening his uniform with practiced movements. The weight of his authority seemed to add an extra inch to his height as he approached the Mercedes, his hand resting casually near his weapon. Inside her car, Angela remained calm. She had been through similar situations before, both as a civilian and as a federal agent. Her dashboard camera was already recording, a habit she had developed over years of experiencing racial profiling. She watched in her side mirror as Miller approached, noting his aggressive stance and the way his right hand hovered near his holster. License and registration, Miller barked before he even reached her window, his tone carrying an edge that was unnecessary for a routine traffic stop. "Good afternoon, officer," Angela replied politely. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Miller's face tightened at her question. "I don't need to explain myself to you. Papers now." Angela maintained her composure, though her heart rate quickened slightly. She recognized the warning signs of an officer who had already made assumptions. "Officer, I'm going to reach for my documents in my purse on the passenger seat. I'm informing you of my movements for both our safety." "Just hurry up," Miller snapped, watching her every movement with exaggerated suspicion. As Angela slowly reached for her purse, he added, "And don't try anything stupid. This isn't that kind of neighborhood." The implied racism in his statement wasn't lost on Angela. She carefully retrieved her wallet, aware that Miller's body language had grown increasingly tense. The situation was following a pattern she had seen countless times in her investigations, an officer creating tension where none existed, escalating a routine stop into something more confrontational. "Here are my documents, officer," Angela said, holding out her license and registration with steady hands. Miller snatched the papers from her hand, barely glancing at them before declaring, "Step out of the vehicle." "Officer Miller," Angela read his name from his badge, "I don't believe you have probable cause to." "I said get out." Miller's voice rose sharply. "Don't tell me about probable cause. You people always think you know the law better than we do." The situation was rapidly spiraling, and Angela knew it. She activated her phone's recording feature, placing it carefully in her jacket pocket. As an FBI agent, she was trained to de-escalate situations, but as a black woman facing a hostile officer, she knew her options were limited. "Officer Miller, I am complying under protest," she stated clearly, wanting her words captured by both her recordings. She slowly unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the car door. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the peaceful suburban street as Angela Thompson, one of the FBI's top civil rights investigators, found herself being racially profiled by exactly the kind of officer she was currently investigating. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she knew this encounter would soon take an unexpected turn, one that Officer James Miller couldn't possibly anticipate. As Angela stepped out of her Mercedes, the afternoon breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass from nearby lawns. Officer Miller stood uncomfortably close, his stance aggressive and intimidating. Several residents peered through their windows, drawn by the unfolding scene on their usually quiet street. "Spread your legs and put your hands on the car," Miller commanded, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. He seemed to enjoy the spectacle he was creating, watching as the well-dressed woman was forced to assume the position of a common criminal. "Officer, I want to be clear that I'm complying while stating my objection to this treatment," Angela said calmly, placing her manicured hands on the hood of her car. Her charcoal gray business suit, which had cost more than Miller's monthly salary, pressed against the warm metal of her vehicle. Miller snorted. "Yeah. And I want to be clear that your kind driving fancy cars through this neighborhood raises red flags. Where'd you get this car anyway? Must be nice living off other people's taxes." A young mother pushing a stroller on the opposite sidewalk slowed down, pulling out her phone to record the scene. Angela noticed this from the corner of her eye, grateful for additional witnesses to Miller's behavior. "The car is mine, purchased with my salary," Angela replied evenly. "Officer Miller, your assumptions and comments are inappropriate and unprofessional." She could feel her phone still recording in her pocket, capturing every word of this encounter. Miller's face reddened at her composed response. He wasn't used to his targets remaining so calm or speaking back to him with such authority. "Oh, so now you're telling me how to do my job." He began an aggressive pat-down, his movements rough and deliberately humiliating. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," Angela stated firmly, maintaining her dignity despite the degrading situation. "Your current actions constitute harassment and a violation of my civil rights." This request seemed to trigger something in Miller. He grabbed her wrist, spinning her around to face him. "Listen here, you don't make demands. I'm in charge here. Playing the race card won't work with me." A small crowd had gathered now, keeping their distance but watching intently. Some had their phones out, recording the increasingly tense situation. Miller noticed but didn't care. He'd been through enough complaints to feel untouchable. "You have no probable cause for this detention," Angela continued, her voice steady despite Miller's grip on her wrist. "My documentation is valid, and you've shown no legitimate reason for this stop." Miller reached for his handcuffs. "That's it. You're under arrest for resisting and interfering with a police officer." The metal cuffs gleamed in the sunlight as he roughly secured them around Angela's wrists. "Officer Miller, badge number 6472. Angela spoke clearly for her recording. "I want to state that I have not resisted in any way. You are currently violating department policies and several federal statutes." She winced as he tightened the cuffs unnecessarily. "Save your complaints for the judge," Miller sneered, watching with satisfaction as several of his fellow officers responded to his call for backup. Two patrol cars pulled up, lights flashing. The new officers approached cautiously, confused by the scene before them. They saw a professionally dressed black woman in handcuffs, standing with perfect posture despite her restraints, while Miller seemed agitated and aggressive. "What's the situation here, Miller?" Officer Rodriguez asked, noting the growing crowd of onlookers with their phones raised. "Got a smartmouth here, thinking she knows more about the law than we do," Miller replied, his tone dripping with contempt. "Probably got the car through some affirmative action program." Angela remained silent now, mentally documenting every procedural violation and discriminatory comment. She could see Officer Rodriguez's discomfort with the situation, noting how he kept glancing between her expensive car, her professional appearance, and Miller's obvious hostility. "I'll need your name for booking," Miller demanded, pulling out his notepad with exaggerated authority. "Special Agent Angela Thompson, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Civil Rights Division," she replied calmly, her voice carrying across the now silent street. "And Officer Miller, you just made the biggest mistake of your career." The color drained from Miller's face as the implications of her words sank in. Officer Rodriguez took an involuntary step backward, while the gathered crowd began murmuring excitedly. The afternoon had just taken an unexpected turn, and James Miller's comfortable world of unchecked authority was about to crumble around him. For several long seconds, the only sound on Maple Street was the gentle hum of idling police cars. Officer Miller stood frozen, his hand still gripping Angela's arm, as the weight of her words settled over the scene like a heavy blanket. "You're lying," Miller finally sputtered, trying to regain his composure. "Let me see some ID." His voice had lost its previous confidence, replaced by a nervous edge that everyone present could hear. My FBI credentials are in my purse, which you refuse to let me access, Angela replied calmly. Officer Rodriguez, would you please retrieve my credentials? The black wallet in my purse on the passenger seat. Rodriguez looked at Miller uncertainly before moving toward the Mercedes. Miller's grip on Angela's arm tightened, his knuckles turning white. Sweat began forming on his forehead despite the mild temperature. This is some kind of trick, Miller insisted, his voice rising. You people always try to pull something. I'm not falling for it. The gathered crowd's phones continued recording, capturing every word of his increasingly panicked response. Rodriguez returned with the black leather wallet, opening it to reveal the golden FBI badge and credentials. His eyes widened as he read the identification. Holy shit, he whispered, before catching himself. Sir, she's legitimate. This is a federal badge. Miller finally released Angela's arm, leaving visible marks where his fingers had been. His face had turned an unhealthy shade of gray. I was just following procedure, he stammered, reaching for the handcuff keys with trembling hands. Leave the handcuffs on, Officer Miller, a new voice commanded. Everyone turned to see Captain Sarah Jenkins striding toward them, her face set in a grim expression. She had received an urgent call about the situation and arrived just in time to witness Miller's meltdown. But Captain, Miller started to protest. Those handcuffs are now evidence in a federal civil rights investigation, Angela stated, her voice carrying the weight of her authority despite her restrained position. Along with the body camera footage, dash cam recordings, civilian videos, and my own audio recording. The crowd had grown larger, and several news vans were pulling up to the scene. Captain Jenkins surveyed the situation with growing concern. This was exactly the kind of publicity nightmare that could destroy careers and trigger department-wide investigations. Officer Miller, surrender your weapon and badge to Officer Rodriguez, Jenkins ordered. You're suspended effective immediately, pending investigation. Miller's face contorted with rage and fear. You can't do this to me. I was just doing my job. How was I supposed to know she was FBI? That's exactly the point, Officer Miller, Angela spoke, addressing not just him but the watching crowd and news cameras. You weren't supposed to know. Your actions today weren't based on any legitimate law enforcement purpose. They were based on your prejudices and assumptions about a black woman driving an expensive car in what you called this kind of neighborhood. Captain Jenkins motioned to Rodriguez. Remove those handcuffs and take Officer Miller back to the station. Call our union rep. He's going to need it. As Rodriguez unlocked the handcuffs, Angela rolled her shoulders and straightened her suit jacket. Camera flashes went off as she rubbed her wrists, the angry red marks clearly visible against her dark skin. Agent Thompson, Jenkins said, her voice professional but strained. On behalf of the department, I want to. Save it for the official inquiry, Captain, Angela interrupted smoothly. Your department is now the subject of a federal investigation. I suggest you focus on preserving all relevant records and preparing your officers for interviews. Miller watched helplessly as his weapon and badge were collected. His whole world was crumbling around him. 15 years of service potentially erased by 20 minutes of prejudice-driven behavior. You've ruined my life, he accused Angela bitterly as Rodriguez led him toward a patrol car. Angela turned to face him, her expression firm but not unkind. No, Officer Miller. You did that yourself. But what happens next depends entirely on your willingness to acknowledge and learn from this mistake. As Miller was driven away from the scene, Angela took out her phone and dialed a number. This is Special Agent Thompson. I need a full team at the Cedar Grove Police Department immediately. And get me the Civil Rights Division Chief. She'll want to hear about this personally. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street as the scene began to clear. But the events of that day would cast an even longer shadow over the department's future and Officer Miller's career. The Cedar Grove Police Department buzzed with nervous energy as FBI agents filled the building. 3 hours had passed since the incident, and Officer James Miller sat alone in a small conference room, still in his uniform but without his badge and gun. His usual confidence had vanished, replaced by a sickening fear as he watched people hurry past the glass walls. Down the hall, in the chief's office, Special Agent Angela Thompson sat comfortably in a leather chair, her recovered phone playing the recording of her arrest. Chief Michael Barnes, a veteran officer with 30 years of service, listened with a deepening frown on his face. The sound of Miller's racist comments filled the room, each word another nail in the coffin of his career. "Turn it off," Chief Barnes said quietly, rubbing his temples. "I've heard enough." He looked older than his 60 years as he faced Angela. "Agent Thompson, I want to express my deepest." "Chief Barnes," Angela interrupted gently, "I'm not here for apologies. I'm here because your department caught our attention 6 months ago. Officer Miller's actions today simply confirmed our suspicions." She opened a thick folder on his desk, revealing dozens of civilian complaints against Miller. The chief's face reddened as he looked at the dates. "These complaints, some go back 3 years. Why wasn't I informed?" "That's exactly what we're investigating," Angela replied, pulling out more documents. "It seems complaints against Officer Miller and several others were consistently buried at the sergeant level. They never reached your desk." Outside the office, curious officers gathered, trying to peek through the blinds. The sight of their chief looking defeated and Agent Thompson controlling the conversation sent ripples of unease through the department. In the conference room, Miller jumped as the door opened. Captain Jenkins entered with 2 FBI agents. "Officer Miller, these agents need to take your statement," she said formally, avoiding eye contact with her former star officer. "I want my union rep," Miller demanded, his voice shaking slightly. "And a lawyer." "They're on their way," one of the FBI agents replied, setting up a recording device. "But you should know that we've already interviewed your fellow officers. Officer Rodriguez has been particularly informative." Miller's face paled. Rodriguez had been his partner for 2 years and knew every traffic stop, every random search, every gut feeling that had guided Miller's policing. Back in the chief's office, Angela was showing Barnes video clips from various officers' body cameras. "Your department requires these cameras to be on during all civilian interactions," she explained, "but we found that certain officers, including Miller, regularly reported technical issues during controversial stops." "This is a disaster," Barnes muttered, watching footage of Miller's previous encounters with minority drivers. "The media will crucify us." "Actually," Angela leaned forward, her voice firm but not unkind, "this could be an opportunity. Chief Barnes, your department can become an example of either failure or reform. The choice is yours." A commotion outside drew their attention. Miller's union representative had arrived, along with his lawyer. They hurried past the office, looking grim. Through the glass, Angela watched them enter the conference room where Miller sat. "What happens now?" Chief Barnes asked, looking defeated. Angela stood, straightening her suit jacket. "Now, we begin a full investigation. Every complaint, every incident, every traffic stop for the past 5 years will be reviewed. Officer Miller is just the starting point." In the conference room, Miller's lawyer listened to the recordings with growing concern. "This is bad, James," he whispered. "Really bad. That FBI agent's recording alone is enough for federal charges." Miller put his head in his hands. "I was just doing my job," he insisted weakly. "No," his lawyer corrected sharply, "you were abusing your position. The racial comments, the excessive force, the false arrest of a federal agent, this isn't going away." As the afternoon turned to evening, the department remained in chaos. Officers were called in for interviews, files were collected, and computers were seized. Angela coordinated the investigation from the chief's conference room, watching as years of hidden misconduct began to surface. Miller remained in the small conference room, this future growing darker with each passing hour. Through the glass, he could see Agent Thompson working, her professional demeanor a stark contrast to how he had treated her earlier. The weight of his actions, and their consequences, finally began to sink in. The sun set over Cedar Grove, but for the police department, the longest day was far from over. A new chapter in law enforcement accountability was beginning, sparked by one officer's fatal mistake of judging a federal agent by the color of her skin. 1 week after the incident, the Cedar Grove Police Department looked more like an FBI field office. Agents occupied several rooms, their desks piled high with files and laptops displaying body camera footage. Special Agent Angela Thompson had made the department her temporary headquarters, methodically uncovering years of hidden misconduct. In her makeshift office, Angela reviewed a disturbing pattern in Officer Miller's traffic stops. The data on her computer screen told a clear story. Out of his last 500 stops, 85% involved minority drivers. Even more troubling, these stops rarely resulted in actual citations or arrests, suggesting they were based on nothing more than racial profiling. Agent Thompson, a young FBI analyst, called from the doorway. "You need to see this." He placed a USB drive on her desk. "We found deleted footage from Miller's body camera. Tech team just recovered it." Angela plugged in the drive and pressed play. The footage showed Miller and two other officers laughing about their hunting grounds, areas where minority residents frequently drove through. The casual racism in their conversation made her stomach turn. Meanwhile, across town, community members gathered at the First Baptist Church. The room was packed with people sharing their stories of encounters with Officer Miller and other Cedar Grove police officers. Mrs. Dorothy Williams, a 68-year-old grandmother, stood up to speak. "Last year, that man pulled over my grandson 3 times in 1 month," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "Each time, no ticket, no reason, just harassment because he was a young black man driving his new car to college." The church erupted with similar stories. People who had been afraid to speak up before now felt empowered, knowing the FBI was finally listening. Angela's team recorded each testimony, building an even stronger case against Miller and the department. Back at the station, Officer Rodriguez sat in an interview room with 2 FBI agents. His conscience had been eating at him since the incident. "Miller used to call it cleaning up the neighborhood," he explained, staring at his hands. He taught newer officers to look for what he called out-of-place vehicles, basically any nice car with a minority driver. In the break room, other officers whispered among themselves. Some defended Miller, calling him a good cop who was being sacrificed to political correctness. Others, especially younger officers, expressed relief that his behavior was finally being exposed. Chief Barnes sat in his office, looking years older as he reviewed the growing pile of evidence. His secretary brought in another stack of civilian complaints that had mysteriously disappeared over the years. Each folder represented a person whose rights had been violated under his watch. "Sir," his secretary said gently, "Agent Thompson's team found something else. There are emails from Sergeant Phillips telling officers how to avoid logging certain stops in the system." The investigation was spreading like wildfire, exposing not just Miller's actions but a deeper culture of bias within the department. Sergeant Phillips, who had helped cover up complaints, was now on administrative leave. 3 other officers had already resigned. At his home, Miller sat in his darkened living room, watching news reports about the investigation. His phone had been ringing nonstop, journalists wanting comments, fellow officers distancing themselves, and his lawyer warning him about possible federal charges. His wife had taken their kids to her mother's house, unable to handle the shame and media attention. The local newspaper had printed his photo on the front page, along with a detailed history of complaints against him. Neighbors who used to wave now hurried past his house with lowered eyes. Angela's investigation team worked late into the evening, piecing together years of evidence. They found that Miller's racist behavior had actually been rewarded. He had received promotions and commendations while complaints against him were buried. Agent Thompson, one of her team members, called out, "We found something interesting." Miller was involved in sensitivity training 5 years ago after a similar incident. But look who signed off on his completion. He handed her a document showing that Miller's friend, Sergeant Phillips, had marked him as successfully completed, without Miller attending a single session. The evidence was mounting, painting a picture not just of one racist officer, but of a system that had protected and enabled his behavior. Angela stood at her office window, watching the sunset over Cedar Grove. Tomorrow, she would present her preliminary findings to the Department of Justice. The investigation was far from over, but one thing was clear: the Cedar Grove Police Department would never be the same. Miller's act of discrimination against the wrong person had opened a door that couldn't be closed, exposing years of systemic racism that could no longer be ignored or denied. 2 weeks into the investigation, Officer James Miller sat nervously in a federal courtroom, wearing a plain black suit instead of his familiar police uniform. The wooden bench felt hard and uncomfortable as he watched Special Agent Angela Thompson present evidence to the judge. His lawyer had advised him to accept a plea deal, but Miller's pride had gotten in the way, a decision he was now beginning to regret. Your Honor, Angela stood confidently, pointing to the large screen displaying statistics. Officer Miller's own dash camera footage shows a clear pattern of racial profiling. In the past year alone, he conducted 312 random stops. Of these stops, 267 involved minority drivers, and none resulted in any significant violations. The courtroom was packed. Local news reporters filled the back rows, while the front seats held many of Miller's victims, people who had finally found the courage to come forward. Mrs. Dorothy Williams sat in the front row, staring directly at Miller with years of stored-up anger in her eyes. Miller shifted uncomfortably as Angela played the recording from their encounter. His own voice, filled with racist comments and arrogant abuse of power, echoed through the silent courtroom. Several people in the audience shook their heads in disgust. Furthermore, Angela continued, "We have uncovered evidence that Officer Miller's behavior was not only tolerated but protected by senior officers." She presented emails showing how Sergeant Phillips and others had systematically buried complaints against Miller. During a short break, Miller's lawyer pulled him aside in the courthouse hallway. "Listen, James," he whispered urgently. "The plea deal is still on the table, but only for the next hour. You need to think about your family." Miller glanced through the window, seeing his wife sitting alone in her car in the parking lot. She hadn't entered the courthouse, too ashamed to face the community she'd have to live in after this was over. Their 2 children had stopped going to school, tired of the whispers and stares from their classmates. Back in the courtroom, Chief Barnes testified about the department's failures. "We got systems in place to prevent this kind of behavior," he admitted, looking aged and defeated. "But we failed to enforce them. Officer Miller's actions reflect a larger problem within our department, and for that, I take full responsibility." Angela presented more evidence. Text messages between officers joking about their discriminatory practices, falsified training records, and testimonies from junior officers who had been taught to profile by Miller and his friends. Finally, Miller's moment to speak arrived. His lawyer had prepared a statement, but as he stood before the judge, Miller made a decision that surprised everyone. "Your Honor," he said, his voice shaking, "I'd like to speak from my heart instead of reading this prepared statement." The courtroom fell silent. Angela watched carefully as Miller struggled to find his words. "I've spent 15 years telling myself I was just doing my job," he began, his voice growing stronger. "But watching these videos, hearing these testimonies, I can't lie to myself anymore. What I did to Agent Thompson wasn't about protecting the community. It was about power and prejudice." Tears formed in his eyes as he continued. "I didn't just fail as a police officer. I failed as a human being. To everyone I've hurt, to everyone I've humiliated and degraded, I am truly sorry. Agent Thompson," he turned to face Angela directly, "you showed me more dignity than I deserved that day. I'd like to accept whatever punishment the court deems appropriate, and I hope to use that time to become a better person." The judge listened intently, making notes. Angela's expression remained professional, but there was a hint of appreciation for Miller's honesty. In the audience, Mrs. Williams dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "Officer Miller," the judge spoke finally, "while I appreciate your candor today, actions must have consequences. Based on the evidence presented and the serious nature of your violations of civil rights under color of law, I am sentencing you to." The courtroom held its breath. Miller stood straight, ready to accept his fate. His actions had thrown an entire police department into chaos, exposed years of systemic racism, and changed countless lives, including his own. As he waited for the judge's decision, he realized that whatever punishment he received would be just the beginning of his journey toward redemption. Through the courtroom windows, the afternoon sun cast long shadows, marking the end of Officer James Miller's career in law enforcement, but perhaps the beginning of something more important: genuine understanding and change. 6 months into his 2-year sentence at the minimum security federal prison, James Miller sat in the prison library, surrounded by books about civil rights history. He had lost weight, and his once proud posture had been replaced by a more humble bearing. His prison uniform was a constant reminder of how far he had fallen, but also how much he had begun to learn. Today was different from his usual routine. Special Agent Angela Thompson had arranged a special meeting, part of a new program where former officers convicted of civil rights violations could meet with community members they had wronged. Miller's hands trembled slightly as he waited in the prison's meeting room. Mrs. Dorothy Williams entered first, accompanied by her grandson Marcus, now a college senior. Behind them came three other families Miller recognized from his patrols. Angela followed, carrying a thick folder of case files. "Thank you all for coming," Angela began, looking around the room. "This is part of our new Reconciliation and Understanding program. Mr. Miller has requested this meeting, and each of you has agreed to participate." Miller looked at the faces he once would have profiled without a second thought. Mrs. Williams's grandson wore a clean-cut suit and tie. Far from the suspicious character Miller had repeatedly stopped and harassed. "I've spent the last 6 months reading," Miller spoke softly, his voice carrying none of its former arrogance. "I learned about redlining, about generational wealth gaps, about the real history of policing in America. But books can't teach what I really needed to learn, the human cost of my actions." Marcus spoke up, his voice controlled but filled with emotion. "You pulled me over 3 times in 1 month. Each time, you made me feel less than human. Do you know what that does to a young man's spirit?" Miller nodded, fighting back tears. "I didn't see you as a person then. I saw you as a statistic, a stereotype I'd created in my mind. I know now how wrong I was." One by one, the visitors shared their stories. A mother described how her children still feared police cars. An elderly man talked about the humiliation of being forced to sit on the curb while Miller searched his car without cause. Each story hit Miller like a physical blow. Angela watched silently, noting the genuine pain in Miller's face as he listened. This was different from his courtroom apology. This was real understanding dawning in his eyes. "I've started writing a book," Miller revealed, surprising everyone. "About my transformation from a racist cop to, well, to someone trying to understand and change. I want to help other officers recognize their biases before they end up here." Mrs. Williams, who had remained quiet until now, leaned forward. "Words are easy, Mr. Miller. What will you do when you get out? How will you make real changes?" Miller pulled out a worn notebook. "I've been corresponding with police reform advocates. When I'm released, they've offered me a chance to speak at police academies, to share my story as a warning and a lesson. It won't undo what I've done, but maybe it can prevent others from following my path." Angela shared some statistics. Since Miller's case, complaints against Cedar Grove police had dropped by 60%. The department had implemented new training programs, and Chief Barnes had retired, replaced by a reform-minded leader. "Your arrest exposed a broken system," Angela explained, "but it also created an opportunity for real change. The question is, will you be part of that change when you return to society?" Miller looked at each person in the room before speaking. "I can't change the past, but I can dedicate my future to fighting the kind of prejudice I once embraced. That's not a promise. It's a debt I owe to every person I ever wronged." As the meeting ended, Marcus approached Miller. "I'm studying criminal justice," he said. "Maybe someday I'll be part of making sure officers like you used to be don't get a chance to abuse their power." Miller smiled sadly. "I hope you do. We need more people who understand both sides of this story." The visitors left one by one, leaving Miller alone with Angela. "You've changed," she observed. "Because of you," Miller replied. "Your arrest opened my eyes, but your program is helping me see with my heart. I just hope I can prove worthy of this second chance." As Angela left the prison, she reflected on how a single traffic stop had sparked a chain of events leading to real change, not just in one racist officer, but in an entire system that had protected him for far too long. 2 years had passed since that fateful traffic stop. On a bright spring morning, James Miller stood at a podium in the Cedar Grove Police Academy, facing a room full of fresh-faced police cadets. His hair had more gray now, and his face showed the lines of someone who had faced their own demons and emerged changed. "5 years ago, I was where you are now," Miller began, adjusting the microphone. "I thought I knew everything about being a good cop. I had the highest arrest rates, the most traffic stops, and what I thought was great instinct. I was wrong about all of it." Special Agent Angela Thompson sat in the back of the room, watching the man who had once arrested her now teach future officers about bias and racism. Since his release from prison 6 months ago, Miller had become a powerful voice for police reform, traveling to academies across the country. In the audience, Mrs. Dorothy Williams and her grandson Marcus sat taking notes. Marcus, now a police academy instructor himself, had helped design this new training program. The sight of former victim and oppressor working together for change had become a powerful symbol in Cedar Grove. "Let me tell you about the day I arrested an FBI agent," Miller continued, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "I didn't see a federal agent. I didn't see a professional woman. I saw only what my biased mind wanted to see, a black person in what I considered the wrong neighborhood." The cadets listened intently as Miller shared every painful detail of that day. He held nothing back: the racist comments, the unnecessary force, the humiliation he had tried to inflict. Then he showed them the statistics of his years of biased policing. Each number in these statistics was a human being, he explained, pointing to the screen behind him. Fathers, mothers, students, professionals, all treated like criminals because of my prejudice. That's not law enforcement. That's abuse of power. Angela stood and walked to the front of the room. "Officer Miller's case led to major changes in this department," she added. "Cedar Grove now has one of the lowest rates of bias complaints in the country. But change isn't just about statistics, it's about human dignity." A young cadet raised her hand. "How do we make sure we don't fall into the same patterns?" Miller smiled sadly. "By remembering that the badge is a symbol of public trust, not personal power. Every person you stop is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's loved one. The moment you forget that is the moment you start down the path I took." The presentation continued with Marcus sharing his perspective as both a victim of profiling and a new instructor. The cadets watched video interviews with community members describing their experiences with biased policing. After the session, Miller joined Angela and the Williams family for lunch in the academy cafeteria. The scene would have been unimaginable 3 years ago: former officer, FBI agent, and victims sharing a meal and discussing the future of policing. "Your story is making a difference," Angela told Miller. 3 other departments have adopted our reform program, and the Justice Department is looking at implementing it nationwide. Mrs. Williams reached across the table and squeezed Miller's hand. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm proud of the man you've become. You turned your mistake into a mission." Miller's eyes misted over. "I can never undo what I did, but I can spend the rest of my life trying to prevent others from making the same mistakes." Later that afternoon, Miller stood in front of the Cedar Grove Police Department building. The same steps where he had once abused his authority now served as the backdrop for community outreach programs. Weekly meetings between officers and residents had replaced the atmosphere of suspicion and fear. Angela joined him outside. "Did you ever imagine this outcome when you pulled me over that day?" she asked. Miller shook his head. "I imagined my life was over. Instead, it was just beginning, but I had to lose everything to understand what really mattered." As they watched new recruits practicing community engagement techniques in the parking lot, Miller reflected on his journey. His former colleagues who had supported his racist behavior were gone, replaced by officers committed to unbiased policing. His own children, initially ashamed of their father, now proudly shared his story of transformation. The sun set over Cedar Grove, casting long shadows across the police department's newly installed motto: "To protect, serve, and respect every member of our community." Miller's greatest mistake had become his greatest opportunity for redemption, and through his fall from power, he had helped build something far more valuable: a bridge of understanding between law enforcement and the community they served.